When Amy asked me to give this presentation, she wants me to discuss federal funding. Well, that's like asking me to discuss the meaning of life, you know. And there's so many areas, so I wanted to focus tonight on a more global discussion. Fortunately, I have Mr. Scott Fry, who has been with our office for 20 years, and with Federal Highway probably over 30. And we also have Dave Tolman from Idaho Transportation, who I'm glad showed up, because if there are any specific Garvey questions to bring up, I'll do my best to answer, and then I'm going to point to him and he can give me the straight skinny. But I designed this to cover just generally on funding, how it's used, the gas tax issue, how much money we get, et cetera, and I'll go through that in detail. Tomorrow there is another session for Compass professionals and invited guests that I'm going to give a little more detail about, you know, how a project is selected and how the funds are obligated, what you have to be careful on, what we look for when we authorize a project. I didn't want to get into that tonight because probably after about 10 minutes your eyes engage back and we lose the audience. So why are highways, roads, bike paths, public transit important to you? Anybody?
How we get around.
I'm sorry?
It's how we get around.
Absolutely. How'd you get here tonight? I doubt if you walked, if you live any distance from here. Although you might have been a little quicker given the interstate there for a while.
Well, I'll share a story, Frank. I drove here on Eagle Road and it was all backed up. And when I moved here 20 years ago, that was a two-lane
gravel road.
Imagine what it would be like now with that volume if it was a two-lane road even.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Russell Street in Missoula, same way. It was a cow path, now it's a 5-lane road. So anyway, it's important, you know, how you get to work, how you enjoy your vacation, how you enjoy your off time, how you buy your groceries, how your groceries get to the grocery store. Those are all critical things. And of course, how are roads, highways paid for? Well, right now, U.S. gas tax is 18.4 cents and 24.4 for diesel fuel. In Idaho, both gas and diesel are 25 cents a gallon. Anybody have an idea when the federal gas tax was last raised? Oh, I answered the question. Sorry. 1993. So have we had any inflation since 1993?
Absolutely.
So we have a real issue, and that is a critical problem with our highway trust fund that I'll get into in a minute. We're trying to build 2015 roads with 1990s money, and it causes us some real stress. So one of the sources, of course, one of the primary sources is gas tax, both federal and state. We also, in Idaho, we have registration and user fees. And particularly in the local governments, we have property taxes, along with other kinds of fees that help fund road projects. We have an overall mechanism in the federal government called the highway bill. And in a perfect world, a highway bill is generally 6 years in duration. That adds some level payment, or at least a steady payment stream to the states. The states can plan things a little better. Well, over the last 4 or 5 years, we have not had a highway bill, a normal highway bill. We've had 1 year spurts. We've had like Safety Lou was the last one prior to MAP 21, what I'll get into in a minute. But they just kept extending. We'll have continuing resolutions, some of which we had one continuing resolution for 3 days, or it'll be 2 months or 6 weeks or something like that. Well, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is, because every time they do that, from a federal highway perspective, we have to reissue all the funding documents for that specific period, whether it's 3 days or 3 months. we've got to issue all those documents to the state, and then they have to build it into their accounting system, and it's a nightmare. I'll have to credit our budget office in DC. Those guys do a wonderful, fantastic job at having to deal with this, because they have no choice. That's based on US code, and they have to follow the law. But it makes it very difficult for the state to plan, for us to deal with the nuances of the new continuing resolution, and it's very difficult. Right now, the MAP 21 bill that we are now functioning under expires on May 31st of this year. And I'll show you the impact of that in a minute. Hopefully, we'll get another highway bill. Hopefully, it's not for 6 months or 6 weeks. Hopefully, they'll have an extended period of time. Given the current tenor of Congress, I don't know if that's going to occur. Any questions about the highway bill itself? Yes, sir.
So the previous expiration date of the one that this was replaced was when?
September 30th of 2013.
Is somebody working on the next one?
I'm sorry?
Is somebody starting to write the next one, or did they wait till May 30th to start it?
Well, you'd think that sometimes is given the result, but they have both a Senate Transportation Committee and a House Transportation Committee. And of course, they have congressmen and senators that are members of those committees. And they also have very competent professional staff. The only problem is, particularly in the Senate, with the last election, the parties in charge of the committee switched, so all the staffers, they also had to switch. So now the minority is running the show, and the minority is kind of shuffled to the back room. And the next election, when it changes again, the same thing will happen. So it does cause some difficulty as far as getting continued continuity between, as far as the bills are concerned. Any other question with this? Yes, sir.
What's happened with the pork barrel projects over the last 10
They,
years?
unfortunately, pretty much gone away. And those are very difficult. And I'll give you an example. There might be a project that will cost $20 million to build. Well, the congressman or senator will send out a big press release and say, Idaho got $3 million for this project. Well, it's never enough to do the project, so it just sits on the books forever and ever and ever because they can't do the job. So it looks good on paper, but as far as functioning concerned, they never work. And of course, you'd see a history of these funds building up, and I dealt with them a lot because we'd have all this money laying out there and there's no expenditures against it. Once it reaches a certain time, it starts appearing on a trouble list and say, well, you've got all this money, but you're not spending it. Well, we can't, because by law, it can only be used for Billy Bob's Bridge over the Snake River or something along that nature. So fortunately, they've done away, perhaps not with 100% of them, but I'd say 95 to 98%, which is a good thing for, at least in my mind.
Just a related question. I wondered if that was causing some of the problem and that the big heavy hitters didn't have those big incentives in there to get the bill passed. So it had a negative effect because they took it away. It just kind of occurred to me. Is that?
You've got a point there, but I think that the overall mindset within both the House and the Senate, yeah, they love to have those, but they realize that even though they look good on paper, they don't really work in the long run. So yeah, I'm sure there's some old timers there that are mad that they went away, but for the most part, I don't think it's had the impact that initially people thought it would. And before I continue, I want to give you my email address so that if you have any questions at all that you either don't think of now or I don't answer properly, shoot it to me. It's Frank, F-R-A-N-K, .Tooke, T-O-O-K-E, @dot.gov. And my phone number is 208-334-9180, extension 120. Feel free to call me with any question. If I don't know the answer, I generally know where to get it. So don't be bashful about lobbing questions our way. And if it's a program question, you're right, say I'm a needle bean counter, I deal with dollars. But if it's a program question, you know, we have great program guys in our office, of which Scott is one. And I'll bounce the question off them and I'll get back to you. But again, don't be bashful about asking questions. however crazy it might seem to you, it's important, and we'll be more than happy to answer. Who's in charge in delivering an adequate transportation system? Well, for the state highway system and the NHS, it's Idaho Transportation. For local roads and cities, highway districts, in Ada County here, it's ACHD. And the reason, ACHD is kind of unique because it's, I think, the only county-wide highway district in the state. Is that correct? Scott? So, and another thing is ACHD also gets property tax. They get about $35 million in property tax from the taxpayers in Ada County. They get user fees and development fees and other things. I think their budget is close to $95 million a year now. Public transportation, the transportation authorities, Valley Rides, which I'm a fond user of, they get funding from various sources, some of which comes from federal highway, mostly from FTA, correct? Amy?
That's correct.
Oh, good timing.
Oh, and then, of course, pathways, bike paths, the green belt, which fortunately runs right near my house, throughout almost the entire county. Number of trails throughout the community that, I think most of the time the cities, or you've got local entities that are responsible for those, but they get money from us in certain ways. In Federal Highway Administration, what we do is we assist with the funding. We offer project guidance, and of course, we oversee the dollars that come through to Idaho. That is our primary role, to make sure that the money is spent right. I like to drop back to an old accounting adage, it's easier to keep people out of trouble than get them out of trouble. So we do our best to make sure that they adhere to the guidelines and that people are aware of the guidelines. And it's tough, once they're violated, a lot of times it's very difficult to do a lot of damage control there. There are ways, but it's easier to do it right the first time. Just a background as far as federal highway is concerned. You know, President Eisenhower was the one that signed the first highway bill authorizing the interstate highway system. And I think it was also called the National Defense System. It's 41,000 miles, and it's part of the NHS. And I have a little, for some reason, there we go. You've got this brochure handy. Can anybody tell me what they believe is the economic impact of the interstate highway system? I'm sorry?
It's gotta be in the trillions. It's gotta be in the trillions.
Oh, I don't even know what the dollar number is, but I'll use an example, a personal example. When I was about 8 years old, which is a long time ago, my family drove from eastern Montana to Lorain, Ohio, which is just outside of Cleveland, and then to Washington, D.C. for a family vacation type thing. And then, of course, back. I think it took us over 5 days just to get to Cleveland. And of course, those were the days when there were no interstates. You drove through every little burg and slowed down and stopped at the stoplights, et cetera, you know, all the way to Cleveland. I think it was on US 10, the highway at the time, which still exists, but obviously I drove from when I transferred back to Idaho from DC a few years ago. I left Sterling, Virginia, which is just a suburb of DC, at 4:30 on Friday afternoon, and I pulled into Boise at 6 o'clock on Sunday, and that was with an 8-hour sleep in Laramie because I would just run out of gas. So you couldn't do that in those days. Now it's commonplace. You look at the truck traffic on the highways, all the goods they move, all the people they move. Look at the safety impact of, you can see it in the trend in highway deaths. You know, we used to kill 45,000 a year, now it's down into the 30s, low 30s, and hopefully going lower. So it's had a tremendous impact. I was asked by my upper management management to ensure that, I tell you that Federal Highway is part of Department of Transportation. These are the agencies that are involved. There are about 60,000 employees in DOT, 50,000 of which are Federal Aviation Administration. So the rest of us, the rest of our agencies are pretty small. We have about 2,800 FTEs and spread among 52 divisions throughout the United States, which includes Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. And I'd say the body count is about half of that number is at headquarters in DC, and the other half is spread around the 52 divisions. Our division has 15 very talented, energetic, and conscientious folks, and I see that with a whole lot of enthusiasm. For example, Scott, he's been around for 30 years.
Yeah, 30 plus.
30 years, 20 of which are in Boise, I think. We have a number of our engineers that have 25, 30 years plus engineering experience, highway construction experience. We've got environmental guys that are, our environmental guy has at least 12 years with Federal Highway, and before that he worked with ITD for a number of years, so. And believe it or not, we're from the government and we're really here to help. So keep that in mind, okay? We started out in the 1890s as an Office of Road Inquiry. I have no idea how many employees they had. It wasn't very many. Evolved over the years, we went through various federal agencies. And then in 1966, we were created. And at that time, there were probably over 5,000 people in Federal Highway, over half of which are auditors, which just warms the cockles of my heart. But I would say it was probably 15, 20 years ago, they decided that we're going to try to shift delegate a lot of the responsibilities over to the state. We would still do project inspections and do reviews and make sure the accounting is taken care of, but we can't do it. Right now, Idaho has 1,200 active projects. About 600 of those are construction projects. Well, we've got 15 guys in the office and we've got 2 bean counters. There's just no way we're going to cover 600 construction projects, let alone the other 700 or so planning and ADA and other types of projects that ITD is involved with. So we have to do it on a selective basis. Granted, we focus on the large projects that have the greatest risk, but we also randomly select small projects, and it's amazing what we stumble onto occasionally. Like I said, our primary role is to oversee federal funds used in constructing and maintaining the national highway system, and that's not exactly correct. We don't pay for maintenance. We want to ensure that it's done correctly, but one of the things we do not pay for maintenance. We'll pay for construction and the actual transportation facility, but we don't do maintenance. One thing I have to say also, because Dave Tolman is here with Idaho Transportation, is I've been to a number of states and worked in a couple of offices, and I have to say that our relationship, sometimes it's a little stormy because we have a tendency to bring attention to ourselves, but for the most part I would say, and Dave could comment otherwise, but I think we've got an absolutely superb relationship with the worker bees of Idaho Transportation. I deal with the districts all the time, I deal with finance all the time, I deal with transportation investment on a daily basis. And those are the integral parts of what runs ITD. Because I like to use the term no bucks, no buck Rogers, and those guys are the ones that are passing out the bucks, and we're helping with that process. But I know other states where the federal highway people, first of all, I can go over to ITD any day, any time of day, and ask a question or meet with somebody or at least schedule an appointment if people are busy. I know other states where federal highway people cannot go to the state direct transportation department without an appointment. And that's not even encouraged. So we have a good deal out here. It really is a good deal. There's another part of the federal aid program, it's Federal Lands Highway. I don't know if many of you have driven the Banks Lemon Road this last summer, and you saw this project going on where they're doing rock scaling along that narrow stretch. I don't know, I guess it's about milepost 20 or so. And it was quite an extensive project, and I don't even know if it's done yet. I know it's been rocking on for a couple of years. Well, that's a federal lands project. And they deal with projects that are on Forest Service land, BLM, national parks particularly. When I was at Eastern Federal Lands in DC, we had a project, it was a really interesting project. We rebuilt Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House and put all these barriers that would pop up to prevent bomb trucks to drive into the White House lawn and blow up. So it was quite an extensive project. Well, Federal Highway built that. And we actually built it. Federal Lands, they actually administer contracts. They have engineers out there overseeing the project on a daily basis. They have surveyors, technicians. It's a little different than we in the Federal Highway divisions do. We get out to the projects mostly just to inspect. We don't have people there all the time like ITD has, resident engineers and inspectors and other people on the jobs. Well, Federal Lands does that for their projects, whereas we don't. We just don't have the people. In Federal Lands divisions, there are 3 of them: Eastern, Central, and Western. Eastern is in Sterling, Virginia. Central is in Lakewood, Colorado. And Western is in Vancouver, Washington. Each of those offices are close to 300 people apiece. They're very large offices, and they do everything from design all the way through completion, construction, inspection. And we've got a mighty team of 15 people, so it's a lot of different. This is just a flow chart. I think you've got this printout. It just shows our office. Pete Harkin is our division administrator. Really competent, capable guy. Gus Janine, he's our drill instructor. He keeps us all in shape. Our field ops people, John Perry. Our engineers, very skilled, very competent group. Brent Ingram is the program manager and our environmental program manager for our programs. And Scott's a part of that team. And then I'm in charge of our relatively small finance and admin team. Very capable. I've got my number 2 is an auditor with well over 25 years of audit experience, both in public practice and also with the legislative audit office downtown. Ned Hansen is our admin officer, and he's kind of an irritant, but he's a cog that holds the office together. He keeps everything going, works well. Basically, our function is we're responsible for overseeing project design and construction. We deal with environmental issues, civil rights, planning, safety, program analysis, and also right-of-way issues. Finance administration, we basically count the pennies, make sure it's done well and done right. I have to say the people in the districts, the Idaho districts, have some very competent construction people and finance people. They do a great job. I'm going to talk about map 21. Unfortunately, this thing never works, so I gotta switch it over. Map 21 means moving ahead for progress in the 21st century, and that's the new name of the bill that's going to expire shortly. Basically, it shows the various categories where it's funded, and the actual bottom line is about, for 14 is about 41 billion. I'll show you the 2015 numbers in a bit. $41 billion a year is right now our highway trust fund. It's the last time I saw a number, it's down to around $8 billion. So we got a problem. kind of the magic that we use to confuse pretty much everybody involved in federal funding. We have something called obligation authority, so last year, and I'm dealing, unfortunately here, we have to do a deal with numbers through May 31, so it's 67% of what the September 30 number is going to look like. But obligation authority is what you're allowed to spend. We pass out about $275 million to Idaho on an annual basis through what's called an apportionment, an allocation. The only problem is we only let you spend $260,000 or $260 million of it. So there's a difference between what you get and what you're allowed to spend. And unfortunately, that's just the way the law is written. That becomes an issue occasionally, especially towards year end when Idaho has been very good. I don't think they've ever let a penny of obligation authority expire. This OA, there are certain exceptions to this where they have special funds, but for the most part, obligation limitation expires at September 30th of every year. So if you don't use it, you lose it. So everybody in ITD is attuned to making sure that they're not the ones that have to go explain to legislators how come they let $5 million expire because somebody didn't pay attention. They pay very close attention to this. So Idaho right now through May 31st got $170 million in obligation authority. Now remember, this is through May 31st, so how much does that work out to be on an annual basis through September 30th? This is a kind of a quiz.
That's 98 months worth, so that's 2 thirds. Is it 9 months or 8 months? You got 5 months in this month, in this year, and 3 months in last year, makes 8.
Yeah, you got another 4 months coming, right?
Right, so you're gonna add 4 months onto the 8 months worth, so half as much again.
Well, I understand that, but it's actually another 33%.
Okay.
Okay. Well, it turns out to be about 272 million. So, and I'm just ballparking it, but and this is kind of what we deal with. We get a notice saying, okay, Idaho got $169 million, and then hopefully on June 2nd or 3rd, when a new continuing resolution or hopefully a new highway bill comes through, they say, you get the other, $90 million, 92. So it makes accounting for this really frustrating. We just have to deal with it because that's the way the world is, but it'd be nice if we could get year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5 through 6. And it sure would make Dave Tolman's job a lot easier. That's just the way it is. But remember, even though Idaho gets about 275 million, they only get to spend about 270.
Hey Frank,
Yes.
what happens to the difference?
They carry over the, assuming they get 275 million, they spend, let's say 270, that $5 million is carried forward in various programs to the next year in the hopes that they'll get more obligation authority. Now this year was actually quite fortunate for everybody, including ITD. They have something called August redistribution where all the states look at their numbers and they might have certain program codes, certain funding that they're not going to use. And they'll turn it back to headquarters and they'll accumulate this pool. It's not so much the dollars, it's the obligation authority that goes with it. So they put this big pool together, and it also includes monies that have been allocated to headquarters for various programs. And this last year, the Federal Highway has a program called TIFIA, and it's an innovative finance thing where they, and I can't even remember the acronym now, but there's like 40, I can't remember, it was a huge, maybe it was 4 billion, but it was a big chunk of change that they weren't going to be able to use, so they turned it back. Normally in an August redistribution, Idaho gets between 10 and 12 million dollars of obligation authority that they can use by up to September 30th. Well, this year it was like $15 million, which is a nice chunk of change. And of course, that was obligated real quickly, including Compass, I believe. And so it's a good thing. So we have to deal with all these little extraneous games throughout the year, but IKD does a nice job in making sure the money is used and used well.
Question.
Yes, sir.
So is the obligation amount more closely related to population or miles of federal highways or anything?
No, well, we'll get into that as far as the apportionments are concerned, but it's usually a percentage, like 90% of the amount that is allocated to Idaho. And it varies, it bounces around 92%, sometimes up to 95%. I have never seen 100%. In a perfect world, it'd be nice to be able to spend all the money or a lot of it, but it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, Frank, maybe I just rephrase the question a little bit. You know, the amount of money that's authorized or allocated, regardless of the obligation authority, how much does Idaho get relative to the other states? And actually, it used to be based on formulas. And so, you know, there were population or miles of road or things like that that were part of the formulas that once upon a time determined how much a state got. And there were minimums also. Everyone got such and such minimum amount at least for the different funding categories. But anymore, it's been a perpetuation or extension of programs. The amount Idaho gets is not based on some data collected on how many miles of road or how many cars or things of that sort. So once upon a time it was, but no more.
Thank you. I'd like to say that there used to be, I think, 4 data points that they used to calculate what the apportionment is to each state. But again, as Scott has said, they pretty much ignored that for the last few years. They pretty much match what you've got in prior years or reasonably close prior years. And there may be a boost in some of that for some reason, but it's pretty minor.
Question, is it pretty much like it used to be where Idaho got almost double what they put in, and California and the bigger states?
Well,
got
I'll
less?
get to that. I have a graph.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not quite double. I wish it was, but to listen to the people back east, like in New York and Massachusetts, and
They say,
I don't know about California because they spend, the federal aid program in California is chump change compared to their total program because they tax so heavily there. And we're just kind of an afterthought, to be honest. Whereas here in Idaho, we constitute, I think, what, 49% of the overall state program per year?
Federal funds, about 54%.
It is 54? You gotta realize these are 8 months numbers. You see, Idaho gets, they've been apportioned or allocated $184 million through May 31st. When you do the math, it turns out to be about 275 million. As of the end of, that's what Idaho will get through the end of September. And look at California, we got about $2.3 billion, so that'll turn out to be about $4 billion, I think, by the time you know about it. Let's see what
Are the percentages all the same per state for each of these different things, or are they different?
I'm sorry?
Are the percentages of these things the same for each state, or are they different?
Does each one of these have their own separate apportionment formula, or are they really?
No, we're one small, for example, Idaho is like .0014 of whatever the total number of these former statistics that we used to gather. Now it's mostly a perpetuation of what happened in the prior years. But the technical answer is supposed to be yes, it's based on these formula, get 4 data items that could constitute this formula.
There's no formula anymore for allocations how
sorry.
does Idaho get a bigger piece of the pie then?
I'll show you.
Is the loss,
I'm sorry, sir?
is the loss of formula primarily due to the continuing resolution process? Because they gotta just figure out, okay, what are we gonna do for a week, a day, a month, a year, whatever it is, right?
Perhaps. I don't know the real answer to that. I think it was just out of,
I think it was an expediency of writing the law.
exactly, I think it was just,
Well, how are we gonna divvy this up now? Well, let's just make it a perpetuation of what the last law had in it, rather than come up with a new formula. It's not very satisfying as an answer, but I'd say that's really what it boils down to. It's simple to just continue the proportions for the states, rather than try and come up with something new and more, I guess, elegant.
this probably isn't readable, but I know you have it in your copies. It just shows the amount of state revenue that ITD gets, gas tax, these are 2014 numbers, about 176 million, and then they have some adjustments for administration and some distributions. So we had a net of about 155. Use tax, passenger car registrations, a number of other registration fees, truck trips and things of that nature. The total's about 317 million, and then they give you, they give 120 of that to locals. Law enforcement gets about 16 million, and the net to ITD is about 180. These are 14, I'm not sure.
Like goes through, it's got,
I'm sorry?
it's got several years, it's historical.
Oh, yeah, I was just focusing on 2014.
Oh, okay.
So if you take the, I guess if you count the local funds and the 180 that goes directly to ITD, you got 300 million, and then we pony up 275, ignoring away. So it's about, what, 600 million a year, plus or minus a few bucks. Local funds, and I guess we agree, every federal highway project, for the most part, unless it's called, what's called 100% money, there are a few programs that just pay for everything. But for the most part, federal aid projects in Idaho require a 7.34% match. We'll reimburse 92.66% of costs incurred. I have to explain that the federal aid program is a reimbursement program. We don't just give you the money and say, here, go spend it. You guys have to come up with a project, incur the costs, and then you bill us and we pay you back. So we very seldom, I'm not saying there aren't occasional circumstances, but very seldom do we pony up the money up front. We always reimburse on projects. And that's the reason Dave Tolman's shop, they bill us generally once a week, except they bill payroll every other week. They send a bill to us, they accumulate it, they accumulate all these costs throughout, I guess they post them all on Monday, run them out to a file, run them out to another file that's uploaded into our, it's called, well, it's FEMA's, it's a financial management information system. And it goes through and makes sure that the state has proper obligations to cover these expenses. We get the bill on Wednesday at about 10 o'clock in the morning. We sign it. Generally, ITD gets the check the next day. And occasionally that night, but usually it's the next day. Now it causes real consternation when the bill, either they send it to us at 10 o'clock and we're out running around and don't get it signed for a couple hours. Well, then it delays it for a day and we get a few frosty phone calls from some folks at ITD wondering why their money didn't hit the bank when it did, but we've been pretty good lately about getting that thing signed timely. That's a big deal because particularly during the construction season, you know, that weekly bill is $10, $15 million. And when it comes to Garvey debt service, which happens twice a year, that's a check that cannot be late. That's one of those things that they'd march me out and shoot me if for some reason that check didn't get posted on time. Had a lot of bondholders upset if they didn't get their shackles in the mail, so. Those are two important days. We try to work with ITD to make sure they have plenty of coverage on that, because we don't want to violate any bond indentures, so. Any question on match?
Oh, I'll ask a question, Frank. The match for Idaho you show there is 7.34%. Where did that number come from?
I'm getting to that, but something
Okay.
happened here. Close it out somehow. Just click it. Next thing I'm gonna bring up is sliding scale. Well, let's talk about donee versus donor. This is whoever, the gentleman that brought up the question about, well, do we get more than we pay in gas tax? Well, focus, these are calendar year numbers, and it's a little skewed because the data I got from the gas tax people at ITD was in calendar year, and our numbers are in fiscal year, so I'm about 3 months off. I'm assuming they're relatively stable. Gasoline and diesel in 2014 collected in Idaho was $229 million. And federal highway funds received was $275 million. So Idaho got an excess of about $47 million. Yes, sir.
That's 25 cents a gallon each for gasoline and diesel. I thought the federal tax was higher on diesel than on
No,
gasoline.
this is state dollars.
This is state dollars.
State tax.
So this isn't the contribution to and from the trust fund, this is.
Well, I lied to you. Those are actually 18, those should be 18 and 18.4 and 24.4. You're still getting 47 million more than you're paying here. Massachusetts, I think, I don't know what they pay out in excess. They collect a lot of gas tax, but they also don't get as much because they don't have as many miles, and the old formula was such that they didn't get quite as much of an allocation as Idaho or Montana. Montana's apportionment was substantially larger on a proportional basis. First of all, it's got a lot of lane miles. It's a large state. But I think part of it is Max Bacchus was chairman of the finance committee for a number of years, and I think that might have helped. But again, I get back to obligation limitation. Even though you got that much more in federal funds, you can only spend another 43 million. Sliding scale, this is where we come up with a match. Normal federal aid match for a project is 80-20. In other words, federal aid will reimburse 80% and the state or local will have to pony up 20%. But because Idaho has such a substantial amount of federal lands, national forest, BLM, military bases, Indian reservations, they get their reimbursement rate bumped up as a result of that percentage of federal lands. So they get 92.66. I think Alaska, which is, they have about 200 miles of federal highway, I think, in Alaska. But they have like a reimbursement rate of 96% or 95%. It's pretty high. So that's where the 7.34 comes from. We'll reimburse 92.66 and the state or the local will have to pony up the match. Now on the state side, that generally isn't a problem, but when you're dealing with some highway district out in the middle of nowhere, that's a lot of money for those folks. So this sometimes becomes an issue. And ITD is become pretty stringent in making sure they collect the match up front, because in the past they've had problems where they said, okay, you can pay us when you can. Well, about 2 or 3 years down the road, when the road is long done, there's still a payable out there, and then it's kind of tough to collect. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but you generally have them pony that up at the very outset of the project. And that can be an issue. There's a situation where the project agreement, it was a local project, it was administered locally, and they put the wrong percentage participation rate in the state and local agreement. I think they had 80-20 in there. Well, the project got finished. Again, this was in a time where ITD did not collect the money up front. Project was done and closed. Hell, the project had been closed for 5 or 6 years. Well, ITD went out to collect the money. Well, they didn't have it. You know, they just didn't have the money. And then they finally realized, the people administering the project realized that they screwed up and they should have used 9266. Cost a local a lot of money. Let's figure it was a $2 million project for something like Atlanta Highway District or some little tiny highway district out there in the hinterlands. And their budget is probably, gosh knows how small it is. So they petitioned us to go back and reopen the project and change the participation rate. Well, that is a bit aggressive, but we did it. We don't do it very often, but in this case, there was no other recourse. So this is a pretty big deal. I was asked to put in FTA is also a funding source for particularly with Compass and Valley Ride public transit. Some projects, bicycle-related, vehicle-related projects. Most of their participation is 80-20 for Idaho. And for projects, they default back to what we use for federal highway at 9266 and 7.34. But you can see they have a multitude of participation rates. Unfortunately, I don't have to deal with those. But Amy probably does, or Tony does. But they asked me, they were trying to be here tonight, but unfortunately, due to funding, they couldn't make it. So I promised I'd do my best to do it for them. I'm not sure if you have this in there, but this thing will be posted, so you'll be able to have
And it is
access.
in there as well.
Okay. Problems, as I said, the Highway Trust Fund. We're operating on $93 for tax collections, and we're dealing with reimbursing projects in 2015 dollars. I think there might be a slight imbalance there. And we do have that. Since 2008 through 10, and then there's been some other general fund transfers. It's been $35 billion transferred from the general fund to the trust fund. Initially, this happened back in, I guess it was 2008. You brought up the discretionary projects, the pork barrel projects. Well, those are really, they had nothing to do with the formula apportionments. Had nothing to do with it. They were on top of that. Well, of course, they'd take them out of the trust fund, and it was aggravating that balance. We weren't quite in the problem we are today, but it did. So Congress finally realized they were contributing to the problem, so they ponied up $10 billion to balance everything out, and then they knocked off the discretionary project. But of late, we collect in the trust fund about 80% of the expenditures that we're paying out. Well, we started off a couple of years ago with a balance of about $40 billion in there. Well, now that balance has dwindled down to 8. And now I think the latest forecast is the trust fund will go broke at the end of August of this year. Well, that doesn't mean we're just going to go out of business and Dave won't be able to bill us every week. The problem is we have this arcane system set up where if the state would bill us $5 million and we're collecting 80% of what our expenditures are, we'll pony up, we'll pay them $4 million, and then we'll put this extra $1 million in payable account until we start catching up. Well, the problem is, given the current state of affairs, are we ever gonna catch up? So that's a problem, and that's also pretty much an accounting nightmare, because we have $1 million this week that we put in there, and next week we'll have $2 million. Pretty soon, we're gonna be owing ITD a lot of money. And they're gonna be in a situation, they're gonna say, hey, you know, we don't have that much in state funds to pay for this until you guys can afford to pay us. And I know Dave and his staff and the management at ITD have discussed this at great length. And I won't get into that, but fortunately, we didn't have to do that, because when they came up with some money the last time they reviewed this, and we kind of got even for a while, but it's just going to perpetuate the circumstances.
Right.
And yes, ma'am.
Question, when you're talking about paying IT, does that include the funds that funnel through IT that go to the local projects
That's
as well?
correct. Everybody's on the same boat. So if we're only collecting 80, they're running out of cash, and they anticipate collecting $10 billion, and that's 80% of what the planned expenditures are. Everybody gets 80% of what they're due until we can catch up. So Congress, the onus is on Congress to straighten out this situation. I was told I cannot advocate, and I'm not supposed to opinionate. I have to be very cautious and not basically saying according to federal highway or having my opinions construed, so I'm very careful there. But being a bean counter, you gotta realize you can't sustain this kind of a situation. We gotta do something. We either cut back on the expenditures that are being made nationwide, or we basically balance the funds so we can pay all the bills. Well, how do you do that? Well, you gotta raise the gas tax. There's a lot of discussion going on, and I'm not privy to a lot of it. We get about a bi-weekly report from our chief financial officer that gives us the status of the gas tax fund. And there is movement in Congress, but I don't know, given the political nature of things, the way things are going now, whether anybody is gonna be passing a gas tax increase. Yes, sir.
So just so I understand, so the 270 whatever number started, right?
Yeah?
Ways ago, you only get two less than 270. And then you only get 80% of the less number?
Well, technically, I guess in a global sense, yes, but let's say on a weekly billing, it's easier to explain it that way. Let's say Dave's crew send us a bill for $5 million. Well, given the amount of collections that we are getting into the gas tax fund on a weekly basis, and actually I think it's 2 weeks, the IRS is the one that collects the tax, so they collect it, and then Treasury transfers our gas tax portion of that to the trust fund. So that happens on a bi-weekly basis. Well, there's a fairly steady pattern as to that. You know, granted, there's seasonal fluctuations in the amount of gas tax that's going into the trust fund. In the summer, of course, when everybody's on vacation, they're buying more gas. It goes up a little bit. In the winter, it goes down a little bit. But there's a general trend as to how much is collected each 2-week period. Well, if we only have 80%, we know basically of the projects nationwide that are in the financial system. We have a pretty good idea of how much is going out every week. We know that we can, like right now, we can sustain 80% of what we're being billed for. So when we get a bill, like I said, I used the example, $5 million. We get a bill from ITD for $5 million. We'll only pay $4 million of that, because that's all the money we're allowed to do. But we also have to account for the amount that we haven't paid, and that builds up into a payable account until such time as the gas tax trust fund is restored to a level where we can pay the whole amount, plus what's due for prior billings. It gets very complicated, and we discussed Garvey before, but what would cause that to be a real problem? ITD builds us, I think it's in June, about 25 mil, and December it's about 40 million.
Just opposite.
Opposite, okay. June is the principal and interest. December is just the interest. You got a $40 million bills sitting out there. And you owe the bondholders. You got a trust indenture that says we're gonna pay you your interest and principal on January 15th. You're gonna get a check in the mail for grandma's $1 million in Garvey bonds that she bought just because they were a great investment and a good return. Well, you think grandma's gonna be pleased if she's expecting a check for $10,000 and she gets 8? Probably not, and that's also probably a very serious violation of your trust indenture. That causes real problems. So, Dave and I had a number of conversations during this we were all getting this set up. Unfortunately, Congress came through and ponied up, I don't know, $10 billion to solve the problem for a while, but it's gonna reoccur in late July, August. So, yes, ma'am.
In Idaho, have you had to curtail payments at all?
Not yet.
No.
I don't think we've missed anything. We haven't, and to be honest, our chief financial officer in DC is excellent. And they work, her whole staff, they work night and day. They were working 24 hours a day getting this all set up in the event that it happened. Unfortunately, it didn't. But we were ready in case it did. But the Garvey situation is a real aberration and a real problem. Dave's not going to really be happy if he has to come up with $10 million overnight just to satisfy the bondholders, particularly when we've agreed to pay for it. Now, understand when we have a project agreement, when we authorize the project, where it says this project is $10 million. Uncle Sam is on the hook for that $10 million. We will pay that, but under these circumstances, we can't tell you. Because when Dave sends us a bill, one would assume he'd like to get a check, at least for our participation percentage. So, I'm sorry, yes, sir.
What's the term on Garvey? Are those 20-year bonds?
I think it was 18 to 20,
18.
19,
18.
18.
Does this kind of put a kibosh on using more of that $1 billion that they have in the Garvey limit, the 999, whatever?
Well, I don't think so. I think ITD's been very efficient in utilizing that.
There's still a chunk left, boy.
The amount authorized by the legislature is fully used. 857 is all the legislature authorized.
Yeah, but I mean, they got that 100, they have that more that the legislature could authorize. I just wonder if that's just kind of, because of all this, that's kind of been put on the back.
Well, I don't think they've even paid attention to this. I think politically, I don't know what the legislative take is. Dave can answer these far better than I, but, you know, I am a very strong proponent of what happened with Garvey. Can you imagine this Garvey corridor here? If they hadn't had Garvey and trying to build that over, good God, you and I would both be long dead, and they might have a third of it done. You know, it's been an excellent thing. Accelerated the construction. Yeah, it's going to cost over the next, 10 to 18 years, depending on the term of the debt. But, they got a lot of work done. And they also got very good prices and good interest rates.
Put a lot of people to work in this valley during the downturn.
Well, I'm not even going there, but yes, it does. And up in northern Idaho and over in southeast Idaho. Granted, they couldn't put a Garvey project in every district. It just wouldn't work. But what they did with it, as far as focusing on the population of the state, I think it was pretty well done. Of course, coming out here tonight, I probably wasn't going to say that too much, but it's been a good thing. Also, remember, Garvey, there's a limit that the legislature put on Garvey. You get 270, 75 million a year in apportionments. Well, the legislature put a limit on the percentage of the annual apportionment that could be used to service debt service for Garvey. And that was 30%, because I double checked with Dave, and right now he said the percentage is down around 21%. You could be like New Jersey. Years ago, when Garvey first came out, I got this from a consultant. We had a conference in San Francisco a number of years ago. And he asked how many in here in the meeting announced how many other states participated in Garvey, and most of us raised our hands. He says, anybody here from New Jersey? Of course, nobody was there, and he says, well, he says, you can be happy you're not involved in the federal aid program in New Jersey because 100% of their federal aid program goes to Garvey debt service. So there's a lot of people sitting around the office waiting for debt service payments and doing little else in New Jersey. So it's you got to be real careful there. And I think Idaho was pretty prudent. And how'd you do on the interest rates?
Average 4.4%.
Remember that time you were guy breaking in money hand over fist in arbitrage? You had to figure that out, but that day was like Steve Wynn in Vegas. He was piling in money all the time, and they were able to put it to use in projects. So, plus some made savings on the project bids. How many extra projects were you able to do?
A lot, I don't remember.
Yeah, it was some good deal. So we do have a solvency problem. How that's gonna be resolved, I don't know. I said 80, but it's approximately 85%. We can't continue to run this way and not be able to pay the bills. Not good. This is just a PR thing I got off the Chamber of Commerce website. Now, there is a downside for federal aid participation in a project. We have certain requirements. If you had to choose between having a project with federal aid participation or just using state or local funds, well, obviously you'd like to have 92% of it paid for by Uncle Sugar, right? Well, we have a number of requirements that are pretty stringent. NEPA and National Environmental Policy Act, all the environmental things that the state and the locals have to jump through and to make sure that they're complying with these. And federal highway doesn't write the laws. We merely have to enforce them. So, and that's not a good thing. I don't know if you recall, there was a project up in northern Idaho along Coeur d'Alene Lake, and there was an underground spring that the contractor blew open, and it was a very wet year. It had a lot of snow, it was melting, and they got a lot of rain, and it blew this cofferdam out, and all this muddy water went into Coeur d'Alene and upset all the families that lived around that portion of the lake. Well, Idaho was slapped with a lawsuit by Environmental Protection Agency alleging the most egregious violation of the Clean Water Act they'd ever witnessed. And a lot of money involved. Well, eventually it was settled. EPA and the state settled. The state agreed to a consent decree where they do all these various things to mitigate similar situations. And I think that's recently been lifted. It worked out. The state had to work very, very hard and satisfy EPA's requirements on that. But you've got wetland mitigation, you've got historical issues, all kinds of things, and it is expensive. And the thing is we will not authorize a project to go to construction without a NEPA document and an environmental data. We're not allowed to. And that's expensive. So as a small local, where if you have all kinds of environmental issues, you're gonna, even though Uncle Sugar's paying 92% of the cost, it's still gonna cost money and most of all time. It takes a long time to get these, particularly if you have an environmental impact statement. I don't know how long it takes to get those done. And we in the state have good people working on them, but these are volumes. We just sent one to our attorneys for their legal review. We sent 4 boxes of documents for them to review so they can get their legal comment. Legal sufficiency, isn't that what it's termed? So it's a very complicated process. There aren't that many environmental impact statements, fortunately, in Idaho. You have to have a pretty big project or something that's unique. But when you have one, it's a lot of work. Usually it's a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact, or a, what's the other one, a CA, categorical, CE, a categorical exclusion. There might be one more, I'm not an environmental guy, but I think those 3 cover it. And finally, Buy America. This is a ugly snake that reared its head about a year and a half ago. The Buy America has been on the books forever. which means that any product that's installed in a federal aid project has to be manufactured in the United States. It's rebar, it's beams, bridge beams, anything that's steel has to be manufactured in the United States. Well, for years, we, kind of said, okay, and just kind of rocked along with it. Well, we had an issue where one of our partners had to go out and buy a bunch of snow grooming machines for snowmobile, or cross-country trails, I guess snowmobile trails. They're very expensive. They're about $400,000 a piece. Well, the only problem is the only place they're built is like Switzerland or Sweden or someplace. And they bought them for a number of years. They said, no problem. The program office in DC said, oh, that's no problem. Go ahead and buy them. Well, it was a problem. So anyway, we went out and asked if we could buy these things. And they said, you got to submit a waiver. I said, well, when did this start? And the guy at headquarters, who's forgotten more about construction than most people know, he says, well, it started the day we got sued. So we got a big lawsuit pending as a result of this. So now anything that you try to incorporate in a federal aid reimbursed project that has equipment or any product, if it's not manufactured in the United States, we have to submit the waiver. We cannot, in the division office, grant a waiver. It's got to be submitted to headquarters, and they tear these things apart. And there's no guarantee that you're going to get a waiver granted. There is a possibility, and sometimes pretty good possibility, but if you're putting Chinese steel rebar in a highway, it ain't going to happen, and you're going to have to redo it, or it's going to be completely ineligible. And another downside to this, and I don't want to beat you to death with this, but assuming you have a substantial portion of these ineligible costs, the whole project can be ineligible, which might be a big bite to chew if you're a local project with a $10 million bill, and all of a sudden $9.2 million ain't coming to you from Uncle Sugar, or we'll go ask for it back. So these are really critical things. And like I said, if you have a question, or if one of your clients or one of your partners has a question, don't hesitate to ask us, because it's a lot easier for us to keep you out of trouble and get you out of trouble. Yes, sir.
Just A6D, I appreciate working with you guys over the years. I mean, Scott's been fantastic, and been a great effort. But one of the things you could add to that list is just competitive bidding and proprietary products, because when you're building a traffic control system, for instance, you bid the common controller, and you bid parts that work with each other, and then when you have to go out and even the documentation of it to get to the point of being able to buy that with federal money makes it just not worth it in a lot of cases. It's just a real challenge there. Just that, not that we didn't bid it competitive, we bid all of our materials for building signals annually, all the poles and that. But then you get into some real challenges there.
I won't disagree with you. Like I said, we're only the messenger.
Oh, I know. And Idaho office is great. I understand it happens at headquarters.
Yeah, but like I said, if you have any kind of a situation like that that's kind of troublesome or vague or anything else, make the call.
Well, maybe a lesson in it too, though, is that you need to be a little strategy when you use federal funds. There's some projects that you might not want to use federal funds on this project for some probably obvious reasons. It's more trouble than it's worth. And then there's other ones that, this is pretty straightforward. This won't have big hurdles. So there's a good one for which to use federal funds. So you kind of pick and choose to, make it most efficient and painless.
We were doing that. The traffic control stuff is great because of the NEPA. I mean, you don't have to deal with the environmental thing there hardly at all. But now finally we've gotten into the more of the proprietary issues and concerns there. So yeah, it is. You're exactly right. We do what we call maintenance. You call construction. With regard, if you do under 2 inches, I think. Well, you get into ADA things too, but we do that ourselves. But the issue of certain depth of asphalt, if you put enough on there, that's construction. And boy, that's much easier for NEPA than going to a new project for spending money.
Well, I didn't put sole source issues on here because that's kind of an arcane thing, and I also didn't put ADA, Americans with Disability Act. That's become a very big deal with federal highway. Those of you that are involved in any project, if you've got any ADA issues, don't ignore them. Because again, that could come back and bite you big time. And I didn't want to get into it. First of all, our civil rights guy couldn't make it. And secondly, I know about as much about that to be dangerous. So, but that's an important issue. The other thing, part of the problem with that, not only is it required, and I've been occasionally disabled, so I sympathize, but they've got attorneys driving around the state, not just Idaho, but other states, and they look for violations or look for a curb ramp that isn't right. And they'll document all this, and then they'll file a class action suit. And guess who gets to pay for it? So that's a big deal. You have to be very careful. And Idaho has gotten to be very, very good at ADA ramps. A few years ago, I probably wouldn't have said that, but now I don't know of any recent installations that have been not correct. Remember one day when they were first doing Vista interchange, the SPUI out here? The engineer on the job is a great engineer, and she was just running that project like a Swiss watch. And I had just gotten back to Idaho at that point. I went out on the project because it was an ARRA project, a stimulus project. So I was just snooping around at the bean counter, and our engineer was out there. They had just laid, I think it was 8 curb ramps. And he brought out, I called him the Darth Vader of curb ramps because he had this special level that measured the degree of slant and everything else. He rejected 7 of the 8. And I thought the engineer was going to kill him. She was so mad, but he was right. And they tore them all out and put them back in right. And after that, they haven't installed a bad curb ramp since. But those are the kind of things that we deal with. And like I said, we're really here to help. And anytime you have a question, don't hesitate. I know if I don't know the answer, I certainly know who to ask, and I can find an answer for you, and I'll promise I'll get back to you.
Frank, can I piggyback a little bit on Terry's question about maintenance? Early on, you said that the feds don't pay for maintenance at all, but I think it's the terminology, because we're focused on maintenance, but would you explain what you mean by maintenance?
Well, I probably should have been a little more specific. We don't pay for like snow plowing or putting, what's that stuff, manual chloride down on the highways, stuff like that. Grooming, we'll pay for the groomers, because we do that all the time, but we don't pay for the wages and the costs of actually doing the work.
I just want to make sure everybody here understands, because we call it maintenance projects, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like overlays and chip seals and
Oh,
that.
yeah, no.
So I just wanted to make sure that folks didn't get confused on it.
Well,
We talked about federal maintenance projects.
Right, and I'm not gonna get into the depth of the asphalt as to what constitutes construction versus
Right.
maintenance. If it's an overlay, as far as I'm concerned, it's a project. But anything that deals with, like, they have a wreck and it tears out a bunch of guardrail, IT goes in and fixes it, we don't pay for that. Chances are we paid for a bunch of guardrail and it's stored in somebody's yard, but I'm not even getting that. And there may be situations that are borderline that could go either way. And with the proper justification, and I emphasize the proper justification, there may be a good chance that it'll work. I can't guarantee it, but under right circumstances. For example, today I was involved in a phone call. Bridge inspection is a big deal for federal highway and for ITD. Well, in order to inspect bridges, they have to have this big truck with this arm where it goes under the bridge, and the inspector, goes under the bridge in this bucket and can inspect the underneath of the bridge, the beams and everything. Well, those trucks are about $700,000 a piece. And I don't know, you generally buy one or two at a time, so it's a big number. Well, the thing is we reimburse generally project cost. Where if a rebar or a traffic controller or something is installed on a project, yeah, we pay for it. Well, how are you gonna do that with a truck that's gonna inspect, gosh, 500 or 1,000 bridges over the next 10 years? You're gonna charge every project $700 to recover the cost of this truck? Well, particularly with a program that's so critical to us. So we looked at it as a program expense, and we will participate in that. We generally don't like to buy assets. We don't buy computers, we don't buy telephones, we don't buy stuff. That goes into ITD's indirect cost pool where we do contribute to that, but that's a different mechanism. But in this case, because it's so critical to what we need to have done to make sure the bridges are safe, we'll pay for that. It'll be considered just a project. So, I won't get into the difference between overlays and stuff like that, but technically we don't pay for maintenance. The definition of maintenance, I'll leave that in the eyes of the beholder. I have some items that are more targeted towards the professionals that are going to be here tomorrow with Compass staff and their invited guests. And I don't think you guys really care on how a project agreement is originated and entered and how it's authorized and stuff like that. You guys will probably fall asleep. But those of you that are just roughly, basically everything that we saw in the document that you saw that showed the amount of money that's allocated to Idaho was broken up by different programs. There used to be like 25 or 30 separate programs. It was just kind of a pain to deal with, but that's the way it was. Well, under map 21, they consolidated those into roughly 5 programs. So it's pretty much simplified that. This is targeted, the types of funds that Compass would have the possibility of using, obviously the MPO planning funds, but every one of those things Compass could probably be involved with, certainly involved to a degree in Garvey. Some highway safety projects may well qualify, of course CMAQ, National Highway Performance Program, and STP.
Could you explain a little bit what the STP and CMAQ?
I'm sorry?
Could you explain a little bit what some of the projects are, or the funding sources are, what they'll stand for?
Oh, well, I can give you the names, and I was going to show you, there's a document. If you're so inclined and you're having a hard time falling asleep some night, we have a program policy and guidance manual. It says everything about every program code, every funding source. For example, CMAQ, there might be 2 or 3 funding codes, program codes under that. It tells you what the funds are intended for, what projects are eligible, what the spending period is for the source of funds. Generally, it's the year of obligation plus 3. Sometimes that varies. There's certain programs where it's, once you obligate it, you can keep that money until it's all spent. There aren't a lot of those, but there's still a few that exist. HSIP is a Highway Safety Improvement Program. I think ITD gets about $15 million a year on that, and that money is targeted for, let's say you've got an area where you've got an odd or an unusual number of traffic accidents, and you can say, hey, wait a minute, we have to fix this. Maybe it's a curve or a blind spot or something. And you would say, we need to spend X number of dollars in order to fix this problem and to minimize these fatal crashes or accidents or something. When that project is submitted to our safety engineer, he'll look at it and look at the justification. The first thing he'll look at is the data that supports the use of highway safety money on that project.
Frank, I'll play the devil's advocate here. Well, why doesn't the federal program just have one category of funds. There it is, $1 amount, and that's it. Go do what you will.
In my world, that would be very nice. I could care less. I'd pay the bills, authorize the program. The problem is we have certain areas of emphasis that we want to stress. And safety is one, performance is the other. Air quality is another. What else am I looking at there? Well, and then just the state STP, I can't think of what the other is.
Surface.
I'm sorry?
Surface.
Yeah.
Surface.
It's kind of a generic or,
Yeah,
all
surface
encompassing.
transportation, that covers a lot. There are different categories in that. You've got STP money for urban areas greater than 200,000 population, which Compass is involved with significantly. You've got another category, STP, between 5,000 and 200,000. I guess that's called urbanized areas. And then you've got less than 5,000, which is rural areas. I would say a lot of the less than 5,000 goes to LTAC or is used by LTAC. Yes, ma'am.
So playing devil's advocate on the other side of this, and then Scott, are there other categories besides CMAQ where the federal government has put them in categories but the discretion is up to state whether or not they want to use the obligation authority in that category?
Difficult question. HSIP is a prime example. I said they get about $15 million a year. Well, I can't think of a year since I've been back here from the East Coast where they're allowed to transfer 50% of that money to STP because they're not using it all. And so they say, hey, we got a bunch of projects here, we could use that away in that money and build these projects. Well, this last year it caused kind of a stir because our safety engineer finally got fed up with that. I got the transfer request, so I went to him and I said, what do you think? He said, I'm not gonna sign it. And I said, well, why not? He said, I've been waiting for a state safety improvement plan for months, and I'm not gonna sign it until I get that plan. Well, I don't know how many weeks in a row I was told that it's coming on Thursday. They just didn't say what year, but we finally got it. It was reviewed and approved, and everybody was happy, and then I signed the transfer, and the transfer went out. Same way with, I guess, CMAQ. Scott can answer this question better than I.
Dave probably better, but yeah, there's congestion mitigation air quality funds, and while the program that the department has is currently active for soliciting projects, the funding is being spent, but it's allowed to be spent on a broader area or type of projects, STP projects. Just one of the fine points or flexibilities of that part of the law. So it is actually being spent, but it's not being spent on air quality projects per se.
Can you explain what would happen if they had an area of non-attainment?
Good. That would tighten things a bit more. But even there, I think the original question Sabrina had was about, you might have a funding category. Do you have to spend the money in that funding category? Well, no, actually. You might have a program that you choose not to spend the money in. You put your obligation authority elsewhere. So there is some mixing and matching. It's kind of a shell game. It's not as simple as it seems, where there's just 4 categories and here's your money and spend it.
Right. Obligation authority can go anywhere. And I think sometimes that can be a bone of contention, but the fact of the matter is that's not necessarily tied to a specific program code or type of programs. But obviously that's where cooperation and discussions and planning and making sure you're all on the same page gets an equitable distribution of that OA in order to make those expenditures. I don't get involved in that much. Our program people like Scott and our environmental folks, and to a degree, our field ops people get involved in that. But that's really a function between ITD and the other partners. They have to reach some common ground onto how and when those funds will be covered with the appropriate obligation authority. So, but yes, there are issues, but I think they're getting better. It'd be nice if we had 100% away and then that problem would go away, but we're probably not gonna see that for a long time. So. Most of these other things are dealing with actual funding documents for a specific project, so I really would prefer that we don't get into that. But I prefer to do that with people who are actually originating and dealing with these on a daily basis. Yes, sir.
I would just make a comment on CMAQ. I mean, that started in 1991 with Steve Sims and Moynihan. They had kept the deal in the Highway Act at that time. And it had some great merit. We built at ACHD our commuter ride program on that. We got marketing funds, we got funding to get people to go and work with employers to do that, park and ride lots, subsidizing van pools. We were at 10 van pools, now we're at 100 after 25 years almost. Great program. Traffic control, we had no one to even time signals. So we funded a year of intern from university to time signals, and the commission took it from there and started paying a salary, and we made it permanent. Now we're up to 3 people doing that type of thing. And we did all kinds of interconnect and bought a downtown traffic control system. That was really a great program. And we had some air quality partial non-attainment, some kind of status that meant we had to get that funding. But as I've looked at other projects over the years, the amount of waste that goes into small projects that fit some little federal box. Either it takes, some of them take 5 years, even a major one takes 5 years, when we could close it out in 6 months, you know, flashing beacon as to what if you could just do it, and it takes you 3 or 4 times as long, you know, and I could just go on and on about projects I've seen over the years. To this extent, I really would like to see federal highways put their put the money, Congress put the money in the things that are of regional national significance. And I think the policy things, most of that is being carried by peer pressure these days more. I mean, the cities have developed their own standards for dealing with air quality, dealing with sustainability, dealing with multimodalism, dealing with these things. NACTO is a alternative to the AASHTO guides. The cities, even the state of Washington's passed NACTO and accepted it as a guide. You know, here's all these things to deal with these things. To the extent that I think that it largely carries the move to a progressive arena in all of these different areas. And I think there's a place for collecting data. I think there's a place for educating and that kind of thing, like we're doing right here. You know, I think it's a great tool, but boy, I just think there's so much waste, and no one's telling that story. Everybody's telling the story of the victories, the successes, but no one dares go out and talk. And their agency just wasted $1 million on something or whatever. You know, and you talk to people agree with me. You know, and
we're not allowed or enabled to do that.
Oh, I know.
It's a legislative thing. It's not that we don't have our opinions, but as I stated earlier, I'm not allowed to opine on things, and it's at least generally, although I've probably slipped up a little bit. But, you know, obviously it doesn't hurt to write your congressmen.
I think also, though, there is a trend or a direction the federal program's going. When you look at, well, there's really 4 categories. Garbage is not a funding category per se, versus what it was before MAP 21. So it's already consolidated significantly, so that there aren't the small programs that you may or may not value or see that they're efficient or practical. The NHPP, National Highway Performance Program, is by far the largest, and with that, the emphasis, the focus on the federal program is more, very deliberately shifted to those high-level systems, the arterials and the interstate So there's a trend or a direction going there, and performance management is a big part of it too. So your wish may someday, we may get to your vision of what, how that federal program should be focused, on
They call
high-level
it
systems.
devolution, but I don't really quite advocate that. I think the money needs to be, they're just spending bigger chunks on more regional things and more, and less tangible things. Once you get into capital, all these rules have gotten more stringent over my time. And I started Federal Highways in 1973. I've seen the Highway Act go to a Transportation Act, go to an Environmental Act, go to a Social Act, just in the names, and then it went back to safety in the name, but it just, I appreciate you using the term Highway Act, because I've got a lot of highway in my background.
Amy asked me to put up, this is kind of my stovepipe presentation of the funding that ITD gets. And I think I extrapolated that to a full year, the full 12 months. We still have railroad crossings, again, a very heavy highway or safety issue. Not a lot of money, but I think it's about $10 million in total. We've got highway safety improvement program. I said that's about $15 million. Rec trails, I threw that in there because it is special. It's a pretty small amount of money, about $1.5 million. National Highway Performance Program, about 150 million. CMAQ is, I think, 12 million. Is that the right number? I can't
That's a good rough guess.
Rough guess. Statewide planning, that's, gosh, I can't think of, that's $2 million. And most of that money ends up going to various programs that run out of headquarters. We transfer a chunk of change every year, over the year, to those people. And metropolitan planning, about $1.5 million, $2 million. I think last year was $1.5 million, plus or minus. Then SDP, about $70 million. CAP is Transportation Alternative Programs. That's kind of a catch-all for, I can't think of, Scott, you can tell me more of the details of what's included in there, but it consolidated a number of programs.
Enhancements, safe routes to school, pardon?
Rec trails.
No.
No, rec trails is different.
Yeah. There's a couple of others that are combined into that, what is.
In other words, just some miscellaneous programs that are probably less than $1 million. But it's not to say that you cannot use, well, let's put it this way. You would not use STP money, if I'm correct, in a safety program, and you won't use safety money without justification in a highway program. If you're trying to finance a reconstruction of some kind and don't have any justification that's safety related, I'll guarantee you that it'll get bounced. So as long as it's justified, it'll work. But so in a sense, you can use inter-program or use money differently, but it's got to be justified. And to be honest, I'm not that familiar with what the requirements are for the National Highway Performance Program. But it's basically, again, for safety enhancement. I know in Idaho, they've adopted a, what do they call those shoulders? 30-degree shoulders now.
So the NHPP, though, the National Highway Performance Program, that is the big program. That is the NHS, which is the arterials,
that's what it is, yeah.
and the interstate. It's the the highest level system in a state.
Can you explain what map 21 did to that?
Well, it took what was previously interstate maintenance and the NHS and the bridge, portion of the bridge program, and put it all into really a focus on the highest level roadways.
You almost got part of your answer there as far as,
Yeah. Yeah, it is a consolidation into a priority network.
What did it do to the NHS?
It enhanced it.
And how did it do that?
Well, it expanded it. It added about 20%, I think. Kind of an arbitrary method, but nonetheless, it expanded it nationwide, including in Idaho. So that previously in Idaho, the NHS was entirely state system. Now it's probably 20%. Several hundred miles of it are now local, such as the Fairviews and the State Street, yeah, there's arterials, non-state system arterials, major arterials are included on there as well. So, an imperfect process, but that's sometimes what happens with legislation. Heat of the moment, you have to do something. But that is the big program now.
Well, yes, sir.
Does the placarding system affect the funding? For example, does US 95 or State Route 55, they're similar kinds of roads, do they get funded the same way by the federal government, or are they treated differently? I'm not talking about the interstate, I'm talking about the US 95
Well,
versus
they're part of the
state route.
NHS, so.
Okay.
They don't really have any meaning, though, in terms of funding or in terms of programs anymore.
Okay.
And in fact, you'll see I-84 business or something like that route through, parallel routes to the interstate. Those don't mean anything anymore. It's kind of from a bygone era. But no, whether it says U.S. or state route on the sign doesn't really have any actual implication in terms of funding or how it's treated. Either one could be a principal arterial and part of the NHS or not.
But does it change the standards though? There may be a different shoulder width or something like that?
The standards for the NHS, if it's an NHS route, yeah, it's subject to that.
But not.
But it isn't because it's a U.S. route versus a state route. Either one could be a part of the NHS, just depending on how it played out in that state.
Well, that's pretty much all I've got, unless you want to get into actual project agreements, which I don't believe we want to do. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I brought some stuff from ITV, some of our stuff to hand out. It was just primer on the transportation system and a little handout on funding. So if anybody wants some of these, they could take those. There you go.
I'll probably pick one up, I might learn.
It's the stuff I sent you in the email, so.
Oh,
with that link.
yeah.
So this is just a printout of it.
If you have any leftovers, could we keep a hold of those?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I'll bring some more tomorrow too.
Oh, thank you. Again, anytime you have a question, you've got my email, and I believe I gave you my phone number. Don't hesitate to call. I will get an answer back to you, and if I don't know,
You'll make it out.
I'll I have been known to do that on occasion.
Yeah.
But I can rely on our professional staff. They're very good. If need be, I can go to our technical people, both at the resource center and our headquarters. We have some extremely good people there that can answer those questions. They've probably been asked them 100 times. But don't be bashful about asking. Like I said, it's easier to keep people out of trouble and get them out of trouble. And that's more from a funding perspective, but still, in an overall project perspective, don't be bashful about asking. I sure appreciate your time and your questions, and I appreciate you coming tonight.